Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the August Air and Space Power Seminar. Today, it's our great pleasure to introduce Mr. Darren Lovett. Darren's the current director of, what's his correct title? He's the Director of Space for the South Australian Space Industry Centre. Darren obviously has a lot of experience in space and is, of course, a Wing Commander Reservist as well. So we're looking forward to his presentation today on an Australian Space Industrial Base. Grand strategy or a strategy of grandeur. I'd like to remind everybody that, of course, we do have the Q&A capability open. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, please throw your questions in, and at the end of Darren's presentation, we'll facilitate those questions. If we run out of time or there's questions that need to be taken offline, we can do that as well. And we'll catch up after the event through various social media channels. So I guess without further ado, I will hand over to Darren. I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Thanks, Darren. How am I sounding? Is it all coming through clearly? Excellent. You know, despite many hours of Teams and Zoom meetings over the last few months, it's still tricky to get the coordination right when you're syncing. Thanks very much for the introduction. Look, two years ago, I had the opportunity to talk in person at an APDC event, Air Power Development Centre event, in Ngunnawal Theatre at Russell headquarters. It was great to be there in person, but obviously the audience is limited given the access there. So it's actually fantastic to be able to do this online and sort of hit a larger audience in some respects. At that time, with that brief, I spent a large portion of the time talking about space and arguing about why it should be significant. Now, 2 years later, that's no longer the case. You know, space now fills the media. We've got an Australian Space Agency, which has been attracting news all around the world, and it's a topic of discussion in the corridors of power. As an audience, I've got some insight into who some of you are, and I think most of you are space savvy. So I'm honoured to be offered the opportunity to speak again on the topic of space, which has occupied my professional area of focus for over a decade. But I'm not going to dwell on the importance and applications of space, really going to focus on the topic at hand. You might be asking, what can I offer? I've been very fortunate to work in my career in defence across several different stovepipes or categories. I've been a weapons engineer at Ardju. I've done some flight operations on P3s, systems acquisition and test. But as far as you're concerned, what have I done for space? I was very fortunate to have 3.5 years in the Pentagon as the Chief of Strategy for the Executive Agent for Space, who was then the Secretary of the Air Force. And one of my first jobs there was coordination of the US Space Industrial Base as a responsibility portfolio. Which really gave me a lot of insight into how the US works and how a large superpower engages all of its elements of space capability, and to see how some of the dysfunction that occurs through there transfers through to capability that we see in Australia. I've also had some time at Boeing, working in Phantom West International in Brisbane, and I'm now in the South Australian government working in the space ecosystem here. I'm still learning the ins and outs of the space industry, but what I hope to do is share some of my insights and observations that I've learned from both sides of the fence. So that's both in industry and in defence. Ideas that I think are worth considering. At my heart, I'm still inspired to continue serving this country, contributing to its national security and resilience, and developing the potential of the nation towards a more innovative society. Now, we may never get off the sheep's back, but perhaps we can have less reliance on rocks and crops and leave a more enduring legacy for our children. So thank you to the Air Power Development Centre and its new director, Group Captain Jason the Booge Begley. I know he's just returned from the prestigious Harvard Kennedy's Kennedy's School's National Security Fellowship. The Air Power Development Centre has always had a broad mandate to shape the Air Force of the future. In particular, my host today is the Development Cell, Wing Commander Tharyn Kingston Lee. He's invited me here, and they've got a very forward-looking remit. Just some of the aspects here. looking at the impact of technological, strategic, societal or environmental disruptors, innovations and drivers on this future of Australian air power. So really important stuff. I was approached some time ago by Squadron Leader Martin Biner during the early part of COVID lockdown to speak on a space topic. And it really hit me at that time, given the trials and tribulations we're all going through, that we should be spending a significant time to understand and support our fledgling, largely startup space industry. And the time was right to energise a discussion around an Australian space industrial base. And that brings me to my chosen topic. Synopsis here, it's a pivotal moment to be engaged in the space sector in Australia. Our small but dynamic space industry is growing. Billions of dollars in capital investment are slated for new defence capabilities. However, despite laudable growth and investment, the crisis has fundamentally altered the national economy, and it really has re-energised the discussion around sovereignty and resilience for a host of issues. The question we're going to consider today is, to what extent should defence policy support an Australian space industrial base? Now, that by no means excludes policy writ large, and I'm just trying to look at the issues for defence, but really it's a whole of nation issue. Okay, so the outline for today, we're going to look at the impetus for change. What are the opportunities of new space as differentiated from old space, and sort of the what the large incumbents tend to do? Provide a small overview about the Australian policy and strategy update, how it pertains to space, and then look at really what Australia could be doing, and then actually show through some case studies what we are doing. Now, it's a very topical subject at the moment, the space industrial base. 3rd of August 2020, Malcolm Davis published in ASPI, an article about towards a sovereign space capability for Australia's defence. And just yesterday, Federal Defence Minister, the Honourable Linda Reynolds, and the Federal Defence Industry Minister, the Honourable Melissa Price, met to consider Australia's defence future. And they really talked about industry and what that might relate to in a post-COVID world. Now, the topic I provided about grand strategy does raise the question, what is grand strategy? And that's where I think we should begin. Now, Clausewitz once warned that there can be no question of a purely military evaluation of a great strategic issue, nor of a purely military scheme to solve it. Our present space power strategy is, through no fault of the system that many of us are largely been part of, it's been largely blurred through a military lens. A strategy integrating the broader elements of space power, government, military, industry and academia would enhance Australia's contribution to safeguarding this critically important domain. Now, 2,300 years ago, Sun Tzu put the physical clash in a broader context, talking about how national strategy differs from military strategy, and a singular focus on military strategy is somehow being distinct from the nation that provides its strength and purpose was fundamentally flawed. The two go hand in hand. Everett Dolman, he renewed a holistic view of power espoused by Sun Tzu. In his book Pure Strategy, he suggested that the military strategist must first discard the notion of victory and winning as tactical thinking, and the pure strategist recognises that war is just one element in an enduring competition. So that idea about competition and adaptation. Now, the integrated view of grand strategy has other historical origins. Thucydides described how Pericles enacted grand strategy by adopting a defensive approach to the direct defence of the Spartans, avoiding battle and husbanding their finances to deplete the overextended Spartans. Liddell Hart placed grand strategy on a much higher plane above mere strategy. And John Slessor spoke of the need to account for moral, political, social and economic factors in addition to the military aspects. So a holistic or integrated view of all the elements of power, not purely military power, constitutes the many dimensions of strategy, and failure to engage in any one dimension invites failure of the whole. This integrated view of how best to employ national power comes under the rubric of grand strategy, and it's a process of weaving all the elements of national power together towards a political end state. Now, space power is fundamental to Australia's security, and it must intertwine with grand strategy, but it need not be a strategy of unrealistic grandeur. So what isn't this brief about? Unlike many of my briefs or discussions that I have with industry, this is not a detailed Space 101. We're not going to go into Tsiolkovsky's rocket equation, though I'm very happy to talk about it after this discussion. We're not going to be talking about propulsion and performance, and nor are we going to be going into sort of the aspects of space flight around the solar system and human exploration. We really are going to focus on the elements of a space industrial base. I'm also going to not focus on South Australia's investment, noting that I do work for the South Australian government, but try and keep it towards a more national focus. But most of my case studies do come from South Australia. What it is a sovereign capability discussion about national security and the flow and effects. Now, what's changed? You might be wondering. Our Western style society and military are fundamentally reliant on space, and space provides critical capabilities to support our national interests. And for the last half century, space has been a playground for two superpowers, then USSR and the US, with an unspoken agreement to tread carefully, allowing the major powers to operate independently. But friction is increasing. One of the articles just in the center there, 10th of February 2020, just shows how something peculiar happened with a Russian spacecraft launched into orbit late last year from Plesetsk aboard a Soyuz rocket. The satellite had been up for less than 2 weeks when surprisingly it split into two and birthed a new satellite. General Raymond, who's now head of our US Space Command, said the way I picture it, in my mind, it's like Russian nesting dolls. We can go on and on about this aspect, and it would normally constitute a large part of the discussion, but I'm going to fast forward to what's happening in terms of the industry aspects. But there are a lot of articles out there. You can see what's going on in terms of rising tension and the prospect of conflict in space. Now, what else has changed? Space is now considered a domain in and of itself. The United States, presently the world's dominant space power, is wrestling with new strategy to address its perceived Achilles heel, an exquisitely engineered, frangible and aggregated space enterprise that underpins a technocentric style of warfare. The debate in the US has been nothing new, and I saw that when I was there in the Pentagon, right at the height of some of the recommendations going through to the White House that the US was losing in a space race. In 2001, so 20 years ago, the Space Commission warned of a space Pearl Harbor and made major recommendations to enhance US space security. Subsequent US commissions, Allard, etc., reinforced a need for change and unity of effort. But really, it's taken 20 years for the US to come to grips with what that means. And they've now formed the newest military service that they've had since 1947, the US Air Force, and published its first doctrine, the US Space Force's Space Capstone publication entitled Space Power. The SCP, which is their first articulation of space power as a separate and distinct form of military power, serves as a foundation upon which they'll build additional doctrine. One could be forgiven to think that we are now in the midst of a revolution in space affairs. So the Australian government also now considers space a domain in and of itself. It is distinct from the other domains, the terra firma domains of land, sea and air, and also cyber. And interestingly, the US in its publication, I believe, is starting to display elements of a grand strategic view towards space power. They talk about space exploration and how it builds soft power to influence. They also talk about US space-based remote sensing and communications. And it's interesting to know that Australia has none of those capabilities sovereign to itself. And then finally, they mentioned that the commercial space industry is a critical element of their national space power. So while we talk about the rising tensions in space, it's important to reflect as well that the healthiness of a society underpins its security expenditure. And the tensions that are arising in space lend itself to the security dilemma and potentially the prospect of deploying weapons in space, which would be a tragedy. Anyone who knows anything about orbital mechanics knows that a debris problem in space is a lose-lose situation for both the protagonist and the defender. The table on the right just shows SIPRI's trend indicator values for expenditure. And I just put this in there just to highlight that Australia still spends a significant amount and exports our hard-earned tax dollars overseas to buy capability from the US and other nations. Now, despite the Minister for Defence yesterday saying that they were hoping to increase the capability ratio of budget from 30 to 40%, with an assumption that some of that would then feed back into Australian society, we're still dealing with many billions of dollars going overseas. And I guess the question could be asked, how much of it could we bring back to Australia to build real capability, notwithstanding that, there are some significant hurdles to get over. Now, how have we done space for 50 years? Many of our national security space capabilities were first conceived during the Cold War. Well-defined and studied adversaries and many space capabilities, such as missile warning, were developed as isolated single mission systems. So exquisitely built, very expensive, very important, with an understanding from all the great powers that they were to be touched. Now, although those strategic concerns are still important, nuclear deterrence, for example, is critically important, it's really a much smaller component of today's much more complex environment. Our space system supports a vast network of arterial systems that support modern society, and it's often misunderstood about how these second and third order effects are rippled through society, and hence what the significance of our space system is in terms of a national security perspective. A couple of points just want to bring out in this slide too, is that old space has carried the legacy through from the Cold War to today. Even General Hayden, who's the vice chief of the Joint Chiefs, has said that space is overclassified, and they're dealing with some issues that we don't really have to deal with in Australia and other countries, such as Title 10 and Title 50, whereby the legislation that allows activities to occur in space are quite discrete and different. And so Title 10 might relate to defence, DoD, and Title 50 to the intelligence community. Some of those issues don't affect us in Australia when we're doing sovereign capability. And I'll talk about some of the things that are happening in Australia's industry right at the end, which show how we can actually leapfrog some of these 50-year-old paradigms that allow us to bring new technology to the fore. Now, we are still reliant on external support from the perspective of weather, missile warning, remote observation, and a thorough understanding of space domain awareness, although we do contribute. So there's a lot of area to move if we are talking about sovereignty and national capability. Now, jumping back a bit, looking at the white paper from 2016, just want to highlight here that there was a large element of space capability in there, replacing comms, new space situational awareness, and we're talking then about $5 to $6 billion. Just recently, on the 1st of July, we had the 2020 Defence Strategic Update and the 2024 Structure Plan released. They both outline a new strategy for defence and the capability investments to deliver on that. For space, it lists or rebadges a lot of the extant projects with a slight nuance. JP9102, the large communications satellite program to deliver robust and secure communications around the world for our forces, now has the added moniker of ensuring that it's under Australian sovereign control. Now, in the past, our comms reliance has been through capabilities like Optus C1, Intelsat 22, which is a hosted payload, and through a US collaboration on the WGS, the wideband, well, the name's changed, but WGS satellites. So what we're now likely to see in that large comms project is a traditional response to a global requirement, which will probably end up as something like geocommunication satellites delivering high bandwidth communications. And that's likely to be a large commercial off-the-shelf solution with a prime going overseas, and that's rightly so. Australia certainly does not have the capability to build anything as large or exquisite as something like a 20-ton bus into a geostationary orbit. But I will highlight that the RFP at the time, looking at 9102, did ask for out-of-the-box thinking, which raises the possibility of different ways of adding resilience. So you can start looking at low Earth orbit to fill holes, or potentially medium Earth orbit to provide different capabilities, which are inherently anti-jam, unlike the capabilities out of GEO. When you're sitting there in the sky at the same position day after day, you are eminently jammable. And in most of the war games I've seen, one of the first things any adversary would do is to go jam communications. But this is something that's seen already in commercial industry. Intelsat, for example, is either cyber hacked or jammed frequently, depending on just different capabilities happening around the world. Nothing too nefarious, just energy going up into space. We also have two other projects that are highlight: DEF 799, which is to deliver remote Earth observation to Australia, and also the newly renamed JP 9360, which sort of congregates the elements of space domain awareness projects 9350 and 9351 in the past. So the money's largely still the same, although the nuance has changed. Now, access to space is critical for Australia's security, and it's why Defence is enhancing its investment in space capabilities. So the 2020 Force Plan aims to improve that resilience and increase sovereign control, but it doesn't address in detail some of the broader elements that might constitute grand strategy. We're talking about industry here, but also CARTA, or the professional force that supports you. And so it provides us an opportunity to shape the narrative as we move forward. Second aspect of Policy 2020 is that we have this issue about $7 billion coming in or down the space pipeline. Interesting to note that the Australian Space Agency has been tracking a strong civil space capital pipeline, and they've observed about a $2 billion investment of capital projects in all states and territories over the next 10 years. About 730 million of that is inbound investment from industry, private foundations and international space agencies. So there is money coming in, just to show you that it doesn't always have to go out. We've got about 90 projects being tracked across all states and territories, but again, it's still small in comparison with the defence space budget. Now, there's also a defence industry plan to talk about sovereign industrial capability and their priorities. It is a couple of years old and will probably be updated, but I'll just make the point there without reading through all of that, is that nowhere in there does space appear. And so again, the time is ripe to both promote space as an industrial capability priority and of importance, and to build the policy around that will support its articulation. Now, I've mentioned the term new space. What is that? Some people call it Space 2.0, others are just the future of space. But the reality is that traditional space services that already fundamentally underpin our way of life on Earth really come from three areas. We're talking about position, navigation and timing, so our ability to take a reference from space. Talking about communications, the ability to bounce stuff around the Earth and reach around the ball. And then finally, observe the Earth from a huge vantage and get those exquisite pictures that are being delivered, as you've seen through the recent accidents in overseas due to the explosions, etc. Now, these traditional services constitute about a third of the space economy, and it's closely followed by ground equipment, providing another third. They're critically important services, and they're largely built on the legacy of those older incumbent space companies. And they use heavy lift rockets to launch large complex satellites into that high geostationary orbit, 36,000 kilometers from the Earth. But really, new space is the technological advances that are derived from electronic and mechanical miniaturization, additive manufacturing, commercial off-the-shelf componentry. That is opening up new possibilities for a new market to ultimately deliver on a 2030 projection of the of the space economy moving to about $1 trillion in projected revenue. So these are very large numbers that some Australian companies are trying to capitalise on. We now have reduced barriers to entry, so it's no longer just the game of large and great powers. And private investment is revolutionising that 50-year approach to space that was dominated by those large powers and legacy industries. At the dawn of an entrepreneurial space age, the new space sector is growing rapidly, and it largely underpins the potential for Australia's space sector. So just keep in mind that it's not the large and heavies that we're going for, the sort of big Apollo type missions or what you're seeing with Elon Musk. We're talking about 20 to 500 kilos launched into those low Earth orbits. As an indicator of activity, the number of new angel and investor-backed space companies globally has increased by a factor of 8 over the last decade. Much of the new space capability will be delivered through smaller satellites, typically under 600 kilograms, launched to low and medium Earth orbit. So that's anywhere from 100 to 1,000 kilometers up, and then out to say 10,000 kilometers to 20,000 kilometers. 390 of these small sats were launched in 2019 compared to 1,700 overall over the last 10 years. So that's an 11 times increase in the up mass of small satellites. So huge growth in the sector. These new space enabled services also have the strong potential to improve the productivity and competitiveness of virtually every other sector of the broader economy, making a huge contribution to sovereign capability. So the point there is, and not just space for space's sake, but how does space support climate change, our understanding of water, and traffic, etc. So there's a lot of applications coming from space that typically were too expensive to be used for something as simple as just looking at what's happening to Farmer Joe's cows. Now, if we're projecting ahead, as the industry is radically transformed by the opportunity of disruptive services, we can expect to see the following trends. A 4 times increase in satellites launched, so some 10 to 20,000 satellites compared to 2,300 in the last decade. And if you can look at the bottom right there, that's just one snapshot of what Elon Musk's talking about with his Starlink system, that sort of mesh network, thousands of satellites in an orbital plane, effectively dominating that area. We can see the increased use of smaller satellites and the deployment of those mega constellations. GEO will still retain about 40% of the value chain, but with a lower number of satellites. And we're going to see a shift from broadcasting services to data-centric services. And potentially a growth of 30% in manufacturing and launch revenue. Now, what's happening in the global space economy? Still growing significantly over the last few years. This estimate from 2018 is similar to the 2019 estimate, which is why I haven't provided the new slide there. But expectation it's going to triple to about 1.1 trillion by 2040. Now, COVID-19, the pandemic, has obviously hit many large global aerospace manufacturers hard, and that will result in revenue loss, and primes will reduce their exposure through redundancies and curtailed production, leading to greater fragility in the global supply chain. In the short term, launch to GEO and manufacturing representing traditional space is likely to suffer more than new space. However, much of the new space is reliant on venture capital, which we have seen as retracting in real terms very rapidly since COVID hit. So it's leaving those small companies who are currently funded with reduced cash flow and opportunities, and those that aren't funded yet in a really dire situation. So now is the time, if you actually want to build something, you really need government support to get those companies kicked off. The global impacts will likely have a disproportionate impact on the growing Australian space ecosystem, and it's a new emerging entrance. However, being small provides opportunity as well. I've seen in my discussions with industry around the place that they're agile and they are thinking ahead as to how they're going to survive and growth, and grow, refocus, and really improve on the very essence of anti-fragility. I'm just going to have a quick look at the Australian space economy. This is an extract from the Australian Space Agency publication material, and their target for the sector is very ambitious. Talking about 20,000 jobs from a current estimate of about 13,000, with an annual contribution to gross domestic product moving from 12 billion, moving to 12 billion from 5.6 billion by 2030. So the important takeaway here is that target of growth estimates range from anywhere from 8 to 8.5%. That is very, very high growth. And so it's going to be interesting to see if we can maintain and keep that up. In the most recent analysis of the Australian space sector, conducted by IBIS World in January 2020, space economy was projected for Australia to grow to about 6 billion to 2020, and move forward to growing about 7.5%. That was obviously made pre-COVID. Now, just as a comparison, look at what the UK is doing. They came out with a space strategy in 2010, their space innovation and growth strategy, and focused on a partnership between industry, government, and academia to develop, grow, and exploit new space-related opportunities. Now, I don't think anyone, well, most of the people I speak to wouldn't immediately think of the UK as a huge player in this global space economy. Their goal is 10% global market share by 2030, and they offer a good model for us to emulate, given the conditions and situation which we find ourselves following them behind. But I have to acknowledge that unlike the UK, we don't have those close connections to the European space industry and legacy partnerships. Now, what's happening in Australian new space? This slide has been built just to show some of the companies there. It is an eye chart. Don't worry about trying to read it all. But this just gives you some insight into some of the companies around Australia that are building real capability. It's not insignificant, and this excludes all the effort that's being done through academia and departments like DSTG through their Starshots program, which are really gripping up a lot of this activity. And we have federal programs as well, like the SmartSat CRC, $55 million federal government investment, but overall a $245 million cash inject to make capability out of some of the potential for new space. So we're seeing some very large hitters play in the space sector for Australia. And the point for defence to note, I think, is that it's happening here, it's happening now. This is not stuff that's just happening overseas. From an investment perspective, just to take away a few highlights, Myriota recently was awarded $28 million in their Series B funding. But interestingly, Myriota was the first company in the world outside of the US to receive Boeing Horizon X funding. So you're seeing the venture capital arm of a large prime like Boeing making solid investments in Australian companies on the space front. Okay, so world-class capability happening right here in Australia. Now I want to talk about culture. If we are to develop a space industrial based policy, we must address culture. 2nd of August this year, just recently, Defence Minister Linda Reynolds warned that her department needs a major overhaul to be able to deliver the government's $270 billion upgrade to the nation's military capabilities. She said that the delivery of new capabilities have been a perennial problem for Defence over the past century, and she was embarking on a reform program to give her the backbone to respond. Now, we've all heard this before, but some of the key takeaways here is, you've got a Minister of Defence saying that the organisation is not adaptable enough to actually deliver. And I think importantly, right at the bottom, we've come to this realisation that Defence has, somewhat belatedly, I would argue, that the Australian industry is far more capable than we had previously given it credit for. So what does that raise in terms of what we might be looking at here? We've really got to address the issue about culture change. John Keegan, the British academic, argues that most historical experience in war is a cultural activity. Colin Gray says that strategic culture is likely to manifest itself in strategic behaviour, and everyone who does strategy in some sense or another is a person affiliated with one or more cultures. So strategic culture provides context for events and a framework of beliefs, attitudes and habits of which human beings are an integral part. So in a sense, strategy is universal, but cultural. Now, why am I raising this? Look at the US. In a classic study written in the 70s, Russell Weigley, in his book on An American Way of War, he discerned the national tendency to seek refuge in technology from hard problems of strategy and policy, and a tendency fostered by the pragmatic qualities of the American character and by the complexity of nuclear age technology. And I would add, it also helps to be the biggest kid on the block. But Air Force is a particular risk as it employs the latest in technology and delivers precise effects. I would argue that Air Force sees things in a more deterministic way than, say, their Army cousins on the ground, attempting to win hearts and minds through the population using counterinsurgency tactics. Space is, or was, at even greater risk. For most of its life, looking at the US here, it was largely the domain of two superpowers, and it's the ultimate playground for the expression of engineering excellence. If you buttress the US experience with a nuclear missile culture, then you can see that it doesn't really encourage free play and innovation on the fly. And it results in the space architecture today, exquisitely designed, carefully optimized, but very vulnerable to conditions outside design limits. And I think that's why you're now seeing these monumental changes in the US and other countries, France, Russia, China. Looking at some of the theories about cultural change, on the left, we can look at Posen, argues that civilian leaders use military mavericks as change agents to cause major change. And I would just look at Trump, General Hyten, General Raymond in the US, and the formation of the US Space Force. So things are happening there. Theory does translate. Another way to innovate is to suffer a major defeat. And that's something that we don't want to get in, don't want to happen or consider. And then a third way, according to Rosen, is that the aspects of inter-service rivalry will drive innovation between those different areas. And now that we have seen the formation of a US Space Force, I think that the doctrine and the strategic thinking that goes behind that will likely infiltrate Allied doctrine and will shape the future in a more positive sense. So for Australia, it's, I think, a lack of space expertise that is problematic when it comes to addressing things like a space industrial base and sovereign capability. In the US, you find many companies and people who have been steeped in a culture about space change and growing up, but it's still largely not well understood in Australian society. So what could we do? Okay, this is where I'm going to talk about the companies that are provide case studies for Australia. The important adjustments to defence policy that was set out in the 2020 Defence Strategic Update were to respond to the rapid changes in the strategic environment. It replaced the framework set out in the 2016 Defence White Paper and came up with 3 new strategic objectives, which I've pulled out here. Shape the environment, deter actions, and respond. Now, what I've done is looking at an Australian industrial base, pulled out those 3 areas and sort of thought about what could an industrial base look like as it relates to Australian defence policy. In terms of shape, what we want to do is see and observe from space, look at the ground and make use of all of the petabytes of information that is streaming down from space every day which is unable to be processed unless we use artificial intelligence and machine learning. Secondly, we want to deter through our understanding of space domain awareness and potentially build capabilities like operationally responsive space, which rely on launch, the ability to launch from sovereign territory with your own built many small meshed satellites. And then finally, to respond possibly through reversible effects such as electromagnetic jamming and lasing. Now, do we have an example? What does an Australian industry base look like? I did mention that I had some time in Phantom Works. I was working as the manager of the Systems Analysis Lab, and I got to play and see how something like the Loyal Wingman or ATS was developed. I came in on the back end of it, but it's a great case study to look at for what can happen in Australia. Taking a concept in a very short few years, exploring the needs expressed by defence through programs like Jericho and the CAF leadership group, and innovating and prototyping using computers and live virtual constructive simulation to provide solutions that could then be traded off against cost. Very rapid prototyping, and we're now seeing after a very short time a world-leading capability like Loyal Wingman currently on the deck ready to fly up in Queensland. Okay, so Australia can do it. Now, although this is a Boeing capability, I would highlight that this has been developed, designed and built in Australia to keep it ITAR free. So if Boeing US comes in and starts influencing the design, it then adds ITAR restrictions, which is something that they don't want with this capability. So really, truly built in Australia. So it offers a good benchmark for what we might be able to do. So what do we have today in the Australian ecosystem? In terms of shape, seeing and observing from space, we can use artificial intelligence and machine learning in the form of the Australian Institute of Machine Learning, just opened in Adelaide recently, a world-class facility, bringing those big capabilities to start looking at what's happening in space and on the ground. Mention a company here, Silentium. They provide passive observation of the sky to build up a space situational awareness or a picture of what's going on there. So again, these are world-class capabilities that are delivering right now through programs like the Defence Innovation Hub and other projects. Now, I'm not going to go into all of these specifically. I have got a lot of comments from some of the company founders that I spoke to just to get their feedback. But I can say that overall, Australian companies are very appreciative of how Defence has delivered some of these early capabilities, these groundbreaking and changing capabilities. But I would note, if you start to think about programs like Jericho, they're not necessarily tied into the acquisition system. They are thought pieces, just like the Air Power Development Centre is. So the question is, how do you translate great thought and great capability and translate it into real capability through an existing acquisition system that is largely built around the existing processes to reduce risk, which tends to lead to capability moving offshore. What are we doing today in terms of deterrence? We have a strong focus on space domain awareness and looking at operationally responsive space through launch. 3 or 4 companies in Australia looking at that. The graph on the right just shows you some of the outlines of what you could get from there. But if we're talking about a national approach to launch, we could have a company in the north or a launch site in the north accessing equatorial orbits, and then a launch site in the south doing polar orbits, which gives some different perspectives than going north from Vandenberg, or sorry, south from Vandenberg, or north over Alaska. The UK is looking at launch sites as well, and it makes sense to collaborate with them when it comes to ideas about how you're going to track and manage those assets as they come either north from the UK, down through Antarctica, and then up on the Australia on the upside, or south from Australia, busting out over the other side of the Earth and then coming back around the poles. So a lot of potential there to work together. And these are important aspects of the new space economy. If you look at the largest launch sites in the world, they are limited. The US only really has 2, Cape Canaveral on the east and Vandenberg on the west. Now, these sites are vulnerable. Developments in North Korea with ballistic missiles has also already shown that a lot of our understanding about risk as it applies to these capabilities is significantly understated. And so having small pads of concrete in the middle of Australia, I think makes sense when it comes to building resilience and the ability to get things up quickly, small, many mesh networks to provide capability. I do know some of you might say, well, what's been done in the past? I mean, I was in the US when a program called Prometheus was done by the US Special Ops Command to deploy 8 CubeSats in space, and this is 10 years ago, to fill holes in the gap that they couldn't fill through the US mega constellations. So we're talking about capabilities that are really needed when you start looking at some of those areas that aren't available through geo communications. 2 companies here I'll just mention quickly. Southern Launch and Duke are currently working on a defence program to look at signals intelligence payload and planning to launch suborbital next month to about 85 kilometres and hopefully into space thereafter. Interestingly, a company like Duke had 1 employee 2 years ago. They're now 20, and similarly for Southern Launch and similarly for Innoble. All those companies are doing real work and real capability to build world-class products that are in competition with global products as well. And then finally, what might we do in terms of respond? Well, we could potentially develop reversible effects like jamming and laser dazzling. These are all technically feasible today at low cost and high TRL. And then if I get back to the US point about classification, most capabilities as they pertain to space are classified. But in terms of the other domains, we've been doing jamming and dazzling for many years. There's no reason you could start to talk about reversible effects like that in order to improve deterrence. I'm getting to my last 2 slides here. At the start of my presentation, I started talking about my experience in space and how I wanted to share the knowledge I've learned. But it goes a bit further than that. I've been very lucky. My father was an Air Force sergeant. He operated out of Woomera, installing the crash barrier to pick up F-111s, and flew up on the very same DC-3 that I flew up years later as an Air Force armament engineer. So I spent a lot of time at Woomera roaming around, sitting in the bottom of those launch sites and looking up at, marveling at what this capability was from yesteryear. My stepfather, who is an ex-Brit aero engineer who came out to Australia for the space program, he sadly passed away earlier this year just as COVID hit. But he was astonished when I told him about what was happening in the Australian space industry. And he had a feeling that the feeling he had back there in the 60s, that it was back on again. Now, I've still kept up with Woomera. I was the Air Force Headquarters Desk Officer assigned to the recovery of Hayabusa 1. And just yesterday, it was announced that Hayabusa 2 will return to Woomera on the 6th of December this year, after being out in space for 5.5 years. And just as a plug, we're holding the next Space Forum in Adelaide on the 25th of November, and accounting for COVID, that will be also streamed live. So as soon as that's available, please join in and find out what's happening. So really, can we relaunch something that was occurring in the 60s for Australia and make it tangible? I say yes. I think in conclusion, I think these are my main points. We need to invoke a sense of urgency. One of the things I've noticed in industry, and the difference between the Commonwealth perhaps, is that in industry every hour is counted in terms of cost. And so when things are delayed or when things take time, it may not be a cost to those in Commonwealth employment, certainly not to me in the SA government. I'm not working on the clock by the hour, but it really is important when it comes to industry. We need to engage and work with a sense of urgency. We need to partner with Australian industry. It's a mandate. It's a policy mandate set out in doctrine and investment policy. Like this discussion, we need to energise a discussion around a space industrial-based policy with elements of resilience and sovereign capability. And lastly, be bold. Let's take some risk. The alternative is far, far worse. And if we do invest in something to progress in Australia, we will potentially leave a legacy for our children, and get off rocks and crops, and hopefully, move forward in a world that is being shaped and influenced with many disruptive capabilities. And with that, Darren and APDC, I'll hand over, and if there are any questions, please fire away.
Darren, thank you very much for that really sort of involved conversation, but there was a lot to cover, and I think there's a lot of detail in there as well. It seems to me, just listening to you, that there's a lot of energy and excitement about space. I'm going to lead off with a personal question first up, but one of the questions that did come through touches on it as well. There seems to be a lot of players from really small businesses all the way up to the big primes that are playing in space, developing a whole bunch of capabilities. Do you think defence is mature enough in its understanding of what defence needs, what we want, and how we prioritise those so that we can actually go to market and develop our industry program in a coherent way?
Yes, it's becoming more mature, and I mean, we're talking about really rapid change. 2 years ago, I'll cite WASPO as an example, and some of the efforts that have been occurring out of there. So that's the Wide Area Surveillance Project Office that sort of facilitates Jindalee Over Horizon Radar, and also OneRSU with respect to C-band radar and the Space Surveillance Telescope. And they also have the responsibility to look at space domain awareness. They are actively engaged with industry to understand what's happening and what potentially they could use. So there are a couple of seats right now sitting up at Lot 14 in Adelaide, with Air Force officers sitting in those and WASPO employees sitting right in industry and academia with the SmartSAT CRC, learning what's happening day to day. So it has been a rapid rise, but I think there is enough background out there to understand what's going on, as long as we sort of share the knowledge. It has been difficult, I know, for a lot of those startup companies to convince defence that they actually have capability that's worthwhile. But as we start to see runs on the board, I think that's going to change, and and I think talks like this will demonstrate that as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'll take this opportunity just to remind everybody that if you do have questions, please continue to punch them through, and we'll ask them of Darren until we all run out of time. Darren, another question we've got in from Malcolm Davis. Given the rapid growth in the space sector, do you feel that sovereign space launch for both civil and defence is a logical step for government to support? Now, I know you touched on it, and I guess my question to you as well, if I can jump onto Malcolm's question, is what are the barriers to that? What's stopping that from happening?
Thanks, Malcolm. Wish you'd warned me beforehand, but no, good question. Look, I do think we have the ability to provide sovereign space launch. Now, if we, as I said in my talk, we're not talking about 20 tons to geostationary orbit. So, £1 million of thrust, something on a Falcon 9 Heavy, is not what we're looking at for new space. And I'll just make one point too. Often people say, well, the entrepreneurs like Elon Musk really did it on their own to capitalize on those new capabilities. Musk has got his own company and a lot of backing, but he also received hundreds of millions of dollars of US money through NASA and the Air Force to build a lot of that capability, just demonstrating that, the fantastic ability to reuse and make space cheaper had a large federal investment through the US. Now, as it applies to Australia, sovereign launch, I think, is a no-brainer. Every war game and exercise I've been in, and these are widely discussed in circles such as CSIS, where they hold commercially available wargaming, etc. They demonstrate that the ability to put things up into space at rapid and short notice is critically important if you're trying to build in resilience. Now, the problem with space is, unlike land, where Clausewitz says that defence dominates, I would argue that the reverse is true for space. Offence dominates. You're up there in an orbit that everyone can predict day after day, and so you're extremely vulnerable. So the ability to put small things up very quickly, I think, is essential for sovereign capability and resilience and deterrence. And like I said, a lot of these small capabilities now, the size of a fridge, or 12 U's, so sort of 30 centimeters, big bricks, providing real capabilities. You can get some pretty good imagery, you can get signals intelligence, you can get comms and fill holes. And so the barriers that we currently have are a lack of investment. Those small companies are out there doing it on their own. And if you look at overseas at what's happening in launch sites, Shetland in the UK, the UK has about 6 sites that they're progressing. Norway recently, I think, put in about 300 million to build up some of their capabilities. So we're competing against the globe. We have sovereign territory that's highly useful for launch, but we're not investing in it in ourselves in any large way. And then finally, I guess we should say that the Space Agency is still wrestling as a new agency with how they're going to authorize and do all these launches. And so some of the companies are still out there, trying to work with them to get those launch approvals beyond 100 kilometers. And if you just look at what's happened in the UK recently, last week, they've released their UK space policy as it pertains to launch. And one of the things they're doing is they're providing a fairly grey way to assess risk. So similar to what we do in the military when it comes to operations, depending on the event, you might have transient risk, you might have static risk due to a house. If you're a baby milk factory, you don't want to be in the flight path of an explosive release. But if you're a shed that houses wheat, maybe it's okay. So a flexible approach to risk and legislation is needed. And I guess that's one of the key points that we're trying to work through right now. It's a difficult issue.
Yeah, thank you. It seems to me that like a lot of technology these days, as the speed of technology changes, it's the policy and the infrastructure that sort of sits around it that kind of lags. So it's an interesting challenge that we have to face. I'm going to get you to put your legal hat on now. You've got that handy, haven't you? With the rapid advancement of space technology and capabilities, to what degree is the space domain constrained or controlled under international law? And I guess this is an important one for the Air and Space Power Centre to understand as well, if we're looking at space as a warfighting domain and how much that applies in space.
I'll actually wear 2 hats for this. With a legal hat, I think you'll often find that lawyers that practice in space, and there are some pretty big efforts going on through the Woomera Manual, Adelaide Uni and UNSW are working on that to develop space law as it pertains to security. They would argue that a lot can be done through international law. Now, if I take my law hat off and put on an operator's hat, the problem is that what we really have is a legal framework that was developed in the 1960s under the mental block, but under the various aspects of space law, and it says things like no weapons of mass destruction in space, so no nukes or bio. But I would argue that anything moving at Mach 20 in an orbit is potentially a weapon, given that you're moving at 6 times the speed of a bullet. It also talks about things like returning astronauts if they land on your territory and not mining the moon. So really, we have a dearth of legal law that relates to space. And we are seeing some of the problems of that in a commons where international law doesn't have the authority of national law. And so as a commons, it's gonna keep suffering those problems. I'd also say too, as an operator, it does offer a country the possibility to interpret things as they see fit. And nation states can interpret international law, can make forays into areas that haven't been covered before. So again, a lack of law means that there's an opportunity right now to go and shape what's happening out there through expressions of norms, through capability, through policy.
Okay, complex space. Peter Kerr has asked, how might Australia leverage the new space thinking coming out of the US Space Development Agency and DARPA, I'm not familiar with what DARPA stands for, to position ourselves for the future?
Look, it's a good question. A lot's happening in the US. So DARPA, AFRL, and other areas developing a lot of capability that is showcasing where technology might go. Now, we have some pretty good relationships with the US in terms of tech transfer and trade. But one of the problems that happens with space, and this is not a problem that occurs in all the other domains, is that anything done in the US that is tainted by a space brush is embargoed by ITAR. And that isn't due to an overreaction the US had about 20 years ago due to a leak of technology to China, where they basically broad brush space and said, right, it's all ITAR. And that includes things like batteries, foils, mylar, wiring, etc. So when it comes to sharing information with the US as it pertains to space, it becomes really difficult. And so we're seeing that already. Some of the Australian companies trying to work with the US, problematic. And you'll see in Europe that a lot of companies will build ITAR-free space products so that they don't become encumbered by that US restriction. So there's potential there, but it's heavily regulated, and it's difficult to access.
Yeah. Okay. This one's an interesting one. What impacts will the ever-increasing volume of satellites have on astrophysics and the astronomy fields of study? Is this an example of why we need some form of international coordination agency? I'm pretty sure there is an international coordination agency, but the proliferation of especially bucket loads of small sats and these things just floating around up there, how do we manage that in the future? I think 50, 100 years away, there's going to be lots of stuff up there. How do we manage that?
Yeah, it's another good question. It probably relates to what's happening with Starlink. So Elon Musk's thousands of satellites going up. There's only a few hundred at the moment, but they're already starting to cause problems with astronomy because you've got all these satellites reflecting sun glint through the night sky and burning out or confusing the imagery. You mentioned that there probably is some coordination agency. There really isn't. That's the trouble. So space is coordinated through telecommunications, so to deconflict frequencies, or through the ITU to jostle for spaces out in geostationary orbit to make sure that you're not moving into each other's slot. But really, at the moment, as a commons, it's first to dominate the high ground is gaining access to that high ground potentially forever. So in terms of Elon Musk, as he licenses out some of those orbits, no one's going to be able to go into that orbit while that stuff is there, Starlink is there. So I don't have any faith that we're going to resolve this issue as a commons just like we don't resolve the other commons issues like water, climate change, etc. I think we're going to get more and more light pollution, and certainly astronomy is going to be dealing with it in the hard way, but they won't be able to do anything about it.
Maybe we need a star fleet.
Be good.
Okay, Peter Kerr's got another question here that sort of focuses a little bit more on defence. So he said, Defence Innovation Hub has invested nearly 30 million in space projects. Do you think there's been enough strategic shaping of this investment? And I guess that probably relates to a question we asked earlier about, is defence mature enough to know what we want to prosecute in that complex area?
Yeah, look, I'm not an expert with how DIH is doing its thinking behind the scenes. But I think it is a bit of a scattergun approach, but some of the best ideas and innovation come out through that because you're talking about disruption. I've been quite surprised at some of the positive things that come out through DIH. We're seeing signals intelligence, we're seeing payloads being delivered for military, like with Innovor developing capabilities that can build cube satellites for defense payloads. I think it needs a more strategic approach, and something like the Starshots program that is currently being developed under DSTG's umbrella. I hope that we'll coordinate and coalesce some of these bigger projects as they move forward. So the multi-mission Starshot, which talks about PNT, talks about resilience in space and observation. Those are the programs I think that will start to provide a more strategic focus, because DSTG's been told, it's no longer just pet projects for blue sky research. It's really got to link into that whole of government issue and requirement. So it's getting better, and I don't think it's been too bad so far. Okay.
I guess with my HR hat on, and I hope that maybe there's some workforce planners in the audience, but we've got a question here about the personnel capability. As we know, the jobs of the future haven't really sort of been designed yet. Do you think that the Department of Defence is engaging with industry enough to understand the personnel capability that's required to support this burgeoning space capability?
Look, I know you've had a HR hat on there, and I don't envy anyone in HR today. It is a really difficult problem. The jobs of the future, as you said, some of them are unknown, and we are having incredible problems trying to tap into that competitive market for a whole host of defence projects, submarines, frigates, and space. It's really hard to get young Australians into those STEM areas. And so there are lots of programs through the Space Agency and Defence to try and invigorate that, but it's really difficult. We're not getting the numbers through, and the estimates for the future workforce are much higher than the current demand. I'll just make one note. For example, a UK space report came out a couple of months ago, and it just highlighted that the #1 job requirement in terms of numbers for space would be software engineering. So again, not your traditional rocket launch, aero propulsion, thermodynamics, or comms, but software engineers really hold a large part of these future technologies, and that relates to cyber, and it relates to a whole host of future jobs that are going to be required. So how do we get more through? That is another difficult problem that a lot of people are grappling with. It doesn't look good.
Yeah, I think there's some work there to be done. Chris Robson, who we all know and love, considering sovereign comms, what applicability do you see for small sats in GEO?
It's an interesting one. I guess one of the problems with comms in GEO is that typically using large dish antennas to get the energy out there. But I think some of the areas that could offer potential, we're talking about formation flying, so not just necessarily large discrete single systems, but if you could put up several smaller systems that can all work together, you could potentially build mesh networks out there that deploy antennas that actually are through that constellation system. And also phased arrays. So we've been using phased array antenna technology on aircraft for years. The ability to take discrete elements and piece them together, and by changing their phasing, you can get huge power changes. Now that's been done in space as well. But again, technology is providing the ability to sort of provide many small systems to aggregate them, which requires very fine control and precision. But with that and timing, you could potentially get disruption there. But still suffering from the perennial problem. You're 36,000 kilometres out. You're dealing with the R² problem. As energy dissipates from the Earth, it falls away exponentially. And physics is still a strong player in that area.
Yeah.
Thanks, Robert.
Hey, I just want to sort of shout out to all the audience that's still online. Thanks for staying online and listening to the questions. We've got a heap of questions come through, so it's really good. The next one I'm really interested in, and I'm really keen to hear what you say. Gary Simons has said, or has asked, Chinese space capability with respect to surveillance, anti-satellite, weapons, hypersonics, things like that. How does the scale and proximity of threat to us drive our capability and our demands? And I guess for me, where I'm sitting at the moment, looking at space power as its own domain, how do we shape that? How do we understand warfighting in space?
Yeah, it's shaping it directly right now. I mean, you've seen the formation of the Space Force in the US, I think, is a direct response to Chinese technology. And so, if you look at the doctrine of the West for the last 30 years, it's been to outmatch its adversaries through technology, which it's done pretty well. And it's provided us with a nice, secure neighborhood and supported our way of life. But what is now happening is with countries like China, as they develop hypersonics, maneuvering hypersonics, they're developing stealth aircraft, but also in every other space, be it ground elements, be it on orbit, be it in different domains, be it with laser communications, any technological factor, they are matching what is happening in the West, and they are also bringing mass to the table. So we haven't seen that in a long time. Mass has returned to the fight, and so if you match technological capability with mass, it's a weaker position for the West. So yeah, what's happening in China and Russia and Europe, etc., really is driving a lot of what's happening in space, which again raises the specter of the security dilemma. Taking away our hard-earned tax dollars to deal with stuff that we shouldn't have to if we're all happy to play along nicely together.
Yeah. Okay, it's definitely an interesting sort of thing to sit back and watch, and obviously we can't sit back and watch too long. We need to be there, but it's a changing space. Okay, we've got a question from Anonymous. Could this rapid growth in space capability for the ADF be considered as a threat to civilian industry? So I guess it's the interplay of military and civilian.
Oh, look, I don't think so. I think it's interesting. The Space Agency made it very clear when they were formed 2 years ago that they would not be an agency focused on defence capabilities. And I think that was to largely, protect rice bowls and make sure that people weren't stepping on toes. But the reality is, most of the capabilities we're seeing in defence and in civil overlap each other. So again, it's no longer the domain of superpowers with large, exquisite capabilities that are only the purview of a few. We now have 70 nations launching into space, and the technology you can buy off the shelf through a catalogue and have it delivered to your home. You can build a CubeSat, and if you can get it launched, you've got real capability there. So I think they're complementary and they overlap. And I think the new models that are being unfolded through DSTG, for example, where you're partnering with industry, offer real hope to sort of bring that technology so that it's not only helping Australian population at large, but it will segue into other areas. So if you're observing the Earth from a security perspective, you can provide the same camera to look at water use, or climate change.
Yeah, and definitely space. As you know, we're talking to a small company in Canberra, and they were talking about an array that sort of has a different view of the same problem that we've used terrestrial systems in the past to do. So I think that's really exciting. This next question, I might get you to just clarify the acronyms if you know them, just for everybody else. But how might Australia contribute and/or compete in the PNT/GNSS sector?
Right. So yeah. So position, navigation, and timing, which is one of the three areas I mentioned that space delivers. If you look at what space has always delivered, which is navigation by the stars, and now we're doing it navigation by satellites. So, the delivery, the development of GPS and other systems like BeiDou and Galileo and GLONASS have provided us with phenomenal advantages on Earth. The payoff has been incredible. So precision agriculture, timing, just-in-time movements, although that's no longer seen as a good thing, has fundamentally shaped the way we do business on Earth, and the cost projections of how it has helped have been in the trillions of dollars. How do we contribute? Very difficult, although there are some interesting schemes coming up. So if you look at OneWeb, which recently filed for Chapter 11, which was the Airbus constellation planning to put up thousands of satellites again. The UK has just bought into OneWeb, and one of the stated reasons they're interested in is to develop PNT solutions. And so there are ways to do this differently, and you can do it in more innovative ways as well. So GPS technology now is fairly old. It's very jammable, the equivalent of a 20-watt light bulb at 10,000 kilometers. 20,000 kilometers. It's very jammable and quite weak. And so, can we come up with different ways? India's constellation uses a very innovative approach. They put a couple of birds out at GEO, so it gives them local PNT capability, and they also incline several of those satellites so that they're dithered and they sort of move in a figure of 8 around the orbital plane. And what it means from an Indian perspective is they look up into the night sky, they see just their satellites providing local position, navigation, and timing for their country, and that's adding to resilience and capability. And it's a fairly cheap way to do it too. Quite clever.
Okay. Are you okay for time-wise to answer a few more questions?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. So Khalid has asked, what are some of the logistical issues faced with bringing space tech components into Australia? And we've also got another question that's in order for defence to become more self-reliant and build resilience with industry, what is the appetite for exporting, for supporting export? So there's a little bit of that import-export and international border stuff. How reliant are we on that as opposed to completely sovereign capabilities?
Yeah, it's another good question. You would think that a lot of the parts and elements come from overseas, but you know, companies here are developing their own products and capabilities. So things like circuit boards and machinery and the ability to machine and develop things. So there are thriving industries here that are sort of edging off from, say, the car industry to make capabilities in Australia. And then that translates to, you know, if you're designing and building your own equipment, you need to be able to test it, shake it, bake it, put it in a vacuum chamber and blast it with ergs. So those capabilities are all emerging in the Australian market. Now, the great thing that's happening with additive manufacturing and the ability to produce small componentry anywhere in the world means that, you know, the ability to do things here in Australia is possible, especially as things move to more software-based componentry like software-defined radios. But I did highlight, if it's US, you have those ITAR restrictions, and if it's from Europe, again, we're sending money offshore. In terms of export, Australian policy said that they wanted Australia to become a larger defence exporter, but in real terms, Australia's been losing ground. And you just have to look at somewhere like Singapore, with a population that's, you know, it's much smaller than us and a landmass much smaller than us, recently ranked #1 in the world for innovation, with Australia coming in at about 96, I think. You know, we are unable to convert our natural sources of wealth and capability to some of those innovative areas to make those exports. But I do see several Australian companies, even in Adelaide, who have export potential, and they've been actively investigated by overseas companies with you know, cutting edge technology.
Noddy Sawade has asked, how do we get the general Australian population to support an Australian space industry? That's a really interesting question. You know, if we cast our mind back to the space launches in the US early days, it was really exciting, and then public interest kind of waned off. So how do we generate a little bit of interest for our own?
Yeah, I think there's two aspects. The space agency's got that as a key mandate to energize the discussion around space and to, you know, share knowledge, bring up school kids and educate the next generation. So they're doing a great job in doing that already, and that's helping. But I also mentioned in my talk, one of the other problems about space is that it is out of mind, out of sight. A lot of people don't know about what they derive from space, the benefits to humanity. And so that makes it a lot harder. And if I can just provide a comparison, if you look at cyber, when cyber started talking about the problems that they were going through 10 years ago, they really managed to grab their narrative. They managed to convince people that their bank accounts were at risk, and so they had personal risk, and they turned that narrative into major projects and programs. So agreements with the US that an attack on one would be an attack on the other, protocols, and a large booming cyber capability in terms of how to deal with it. Space has not had the same success. So overclassification for 50 years means that most of the problems that were happening in space, nobody knew about. We're only starting to see in the last 5 years that open discussion about what's going on with that article I mentioned about the Russian nesting dolls, or Chinese satellites in space moving around geostationary orbit being picked up by commercial space observers that then report on what they're seeing. So yeah, very difficult for space to make that translation because it is a different domain and it's not intuitive. It operates under different laws and it has different aspects of how it delivers capabilities. So I think for us, the difficult thing is to educate, and keep bringing to home how space is, you know, important for the average person on Earth.
Yeah, that's good. And I hope we've got some papers coming out to talk about that, the reliance of society on space. So maybe we can work together. Hey, I think we'll take one final question, and I think it's a really interesting one. To follow on to Gary Simon's question earlier, but it was not from Gary. But he says, does the ADF need a space component command / echelon? Obviously, with the confirmation recently that the Chief of Air Force owns the space domain, and there's a whole bunch of other things going on in defence, do we follow the US with a space force, or how do we manage that, do you think?
Yeah, that's another great question. You know, often when you see what's happening in our allied space, we try and translate that to Australia or the other areas. Look, the short answer is, I would say no. I do think culture is important. The culture of a space-minded force is very important, and I don't just mean the operators. I mean an interdisciplinary force that understands the nuances of political play in space. You know, what are the economics of moving around in space, and then also the operational considerations. So within the Australian Air Force, I think we definitely need that that robust, career-driven space professional that is advising and advocating on the domain's behalf. But it's a simple numbers game. You know, you look at the US, they have 30,000 space professionals in Space Command, with about 1,300 full-time dedicated space officers who are groomed from the point they join the US Air Force Academy right through to the end of their career as a space cadre. In Australia, we have about, I won't mention numbers, but we've got 2 orders of magnitude less. So, you know, with all the other problems that the ADF is facing, new fighters, new tankers, new airborne early warning, we've got new UAVs, and space and cyber to thrown into boot. You know, the forces are grappling with a lot of issues, and I don't think we have the numbers to build an entire component out of that. But it makes it important to understand each other's areas so that you can represent and acknowledge the importance of you know, domain issues.
Yeah. Okay. Look, we might take that opportunity to end the webinar now. There are a few other questions coming through, so what we might do is get you to maybe write some answers for that, and we'll post those back to those individuals in due course. Darren, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to both prepare the presentation, but also to deliver and answer the questions quite openly and honestly today. To all the viewers that are still online, thank you for joining us. I hope it was beneficial and informative. And I guess it would be remiss of me not to plug the September Air and Space Power Seminar, where we're talking to Dr. Elena Sitnikova, and she'll talk to us about cybersecurity and aviation operations. So hopefully that you can join us for that webinar as well. So with that, I think we'll turn it off. Thank you very much, Darren, and we'll see everybody in a month's time.
Thanks, Air Power Development Centre, and Darren. Thank you. Cheers.